eroding pluralism of this country is a serious concern. I do agree that, given the context of majoritarian politics that is playing out in much of the Indo-Gangetic plains, and for that matter here in southern India as well, is, deeply problematic. But we should situate that in the context of what the Indian Union is. I think these are symptoms of what is a larger, deeper question on the viability of the Indian Union vis-a-vis the resource allocation problems that the Union has. Right? It's easy to sort of treat these symptoms and forget the original problem. The original problem is that, can we have these disparate states in very different growth trajectories, in very different stages of their growth, ever be in the same fiscal union with the same sort of almost unitary form of government, with increasing tendencies towards unitary form of government that we have, and yet achieve the sort of representation of people's will that the democracy demands? I think it is becoming mathematically impossible. And what we see is a reflection of that. It is easy for us to basically say that, these are eroding liberal values or eroding pluralism, so on and so forth. But I think what is being represented in the politics at the end is, like someone more famous than I has said, what politics is essentially war by other means. Right? And in the long trajectory of things, what you see is a movement towards an unstable society, and the reason for that unstable society is these serious sort of resource allocation problems at the core of this. The federal character of our polity is some kind of a safety valve of democracy, right? If we do not have that, it is what allows us to achieve the representing people's will at the various layers of government across this country in various forms of for instance, we are right now in Kerala. The achievements of this particular state in health, in education, and in various social indices are just not comparable to, let's say, Madhya Pradesh, for instance, right? Now, what you want in such a system is for the people of Kerala to have a government which represents their aspirations and their politics at this level, right? And if you were to instead have Kerala and Madhya Pradesh in the same union and have a similar policy, which is exactly what the union government is attempting to do, it is just impossible. You are either going to disappoint people in Madhya Pradesh or disappoint people in Kerala, or both. The idea of a double engine growth, I don't know if there is anybody who actually looks at this and votes for it. If they do, I really want to have a conversation with them, because the union government exists for the purpose of being a union government. The state government exists for the purpose of being a state government. The idea that because these two governments happen to the same party sort of runs these two governments has no relationship with the idea of these, like how do I say this? If there is one government, let's say, the left front has a government in Kerala, the union government, the BJP sort of has formed the government in the union. Once they form the union, how does it matter? They're governments. That they have a political bent is one thing. But a government-to-government relationship cannot be colored by the idea of which party forms the government, right? And so this is, it is one thing to have it as an implicit idea in terms of political subterfuge. To have it as an explicit slogan in electioneering is beggars belief, because it just makes a laughing stock of the idea of a federal structure of our government. What is a double engine government? Is the union government trying to argue that those governments where state governments wherein the state government and the union government belong to the same political party will have some preferential treatment? Is that an implication? If that is an implication, like you rightly said, that's violative of the Constitution. Secondly, more than being a violation of the Constitution, we should look at these governments as representation of people's will, right? Like, it is not as if just because a state has, voted one government at the state level and we have another government at the union level, possibly the state voted that government in terms of, voting that party's MPs, or it voted for some other political party, right? But this state is also represented in the union government. Like, what is this concept of double engine. I mean, whose engine is it? Increasingly, the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, the Home Minister, and possibly other cabinet ministers have all made the argument to the effect of, it's also true that previous governments have done some version of this, except that this government has done it at a much larger degree, and we now live in a social media environment where it gets blown out of proportion, right? But whenever a union government official in any capacity comes to a state and says that, we are giving your state X, like it almost beggars belief again, because especially when they do that to states like Tamil Nadu or Karnataka or Kerala or Maharashtra, because these are states which essentially fund the union government. It is one, even if you go to a state such as Bihar or Uttar Pradesh, which sort of, draw more funds than they give into the, consolidated fund of India, you're not supposed to be doing that, because at the end of the day, those are also legitimate governments and legitimate states, and therefore it is their right to have access to the consolidated fund of India. But it becomes even more laughable and absurd if a minister of the union government comes to a state like Tamil Nadu and says that, we are giving you money, right? I'm like, whose money is it? It's our money. It just happens to be there, right? Firstly, you're obligated to give it to us. Secondly, if you're delaying giving it to us, that is, you're not doing your job properly. Thirdly, you're not supposed to be saying this because it's our money in the first place. The reason why you exist there is to facilitate this transfer, right? It is not your largesse that you're giving this money, right? And that ministers in the union cabinet do this repeatedly is a worrying factor for what is the federal structure of this country. What we need to look at here is in a representative democracy, we install people to do a specific job. Those people happen to get called leaders, but they shouldn't take us calling them leaders too seriously. They exist to do a job which is no different from, it's a glorified bureaucrat's job. I agree that the politician has a greater moral authority than an unelected bureaucrat. But the point of a democracy is that politicians exist in their positions of power to carry out our will, as the will of the people. They do not, the money that they collect in the form of taxes is not their money. The constitutional system mandates a certain flow of, collection and reverse flow of it thereof. If we want a change in that particular system, we should, enact those kinds of changes through acts of parliament, and the executive in the form of minister has nothing to do with that. It's an act of parliament. So the moment somebody comes and says, I am giving it to you, or my party is giving it to you, those are extremely, to use the oft-repeated word, fascist ideas. If we do go in the trajectory that we have gone in the last, it's convenient to say in the last decade, but I think this particular tendency of increasing centralization and reducing the pluralism of this country, both in terms of the federal polity and in terms of the social structure, has been going on for a while. Right, sociologists will tell you that, political scientists will tell you that, anthropologists will tell you that this has been and that again, it is easy to look at each strand of this and worry about it in isolation. But I think where I come from is to argue that these are symptoms of an underlying unviability of the political union that we sort of are in, and we need to think deeper about, are we sort of enabling the aspirations of the various people in various layers of government? Are we allowing those aspirations to be reflected in that particular layer of government? That is something that we need to seriously worry about, think about, and the answer to that is extreme decentralization, because you have a country of 1.4 billion people. It is impossible for any government to do, to be reasonably successful across all these 1.4 billion people. It's just mathematically impossible. And over on top of that, the diversity and the divergence of India's various states is just extreme, right? You could argue that, the only comparable country, two countries to India's size and scale in terms of its, the number of states and the population, probably China and to a lesser extent the United States. Both those are, run in far more decentralized manners in their own ways, right? Like you could argue China is a one-party state. It is, but the provinces there are extremely powerful. The United States, for instance, has the idea of states' rights embedded in its foundation, right? India, though, has a complicated history of that, and it has been moving towards a greater unitary form of polity and policy. If we do not have decentralization as the North Star of our policy and politics, we will end up in serious trouble. It doesn't matter which party comes to power, which party wins elections. It doesn't matter what the social strife situation is, because if at the end of the day there are resource allocation problems which do not have solutions, they will come up because people's pocketbook issues just, they reveal themselves as religious strife sometimes, they reveal themselves as political strife sometimes, but the underlying issue is that there is, if there are people in Kerala who are relatively prosperous, are relatively well-educated, are relatively sort of healthy, and they want to have a certain kind of a progressive union, a progressive state at their level, and they feel entitled to that by, a century-old social movement that has allowed them for it. And then they are forced into a union with, like, let's say Madhya Pradesh, for instance. Kerala's IMR, for instance, is 6. It's comparable to the United States. Madhya Pradesh has an IMR of 48. That is comparable to Afghanistan. It is just impossible for one policy to address the United States and Afghanistan with a single health policy, except that is precisely what the union government is attempting to do. Now, if you have such a situation, either Kerala is going to be really unhappy and revolt, or Madhya Pradesh is going to be really unhappy and revolt, or both of them are going to do that. There is just mathematically no possibility of having a single policy solution for these two things, unless our overall politics, traverses towards decentralization, which allows Kerala and Madhya Pradesh to have their own policy and some form of fiscal sovereignty at their, state level, which allows for the aspirations of their people in terms of policy to sort of, address these divergences. I worry for this union. How politicians need to run their political campaigns, I probably am not qualified to answer that, given that, I probably can't even win a Residents' Welfare Association election. But the point is that I think serious people need to think about the underlying problem of the impossibility and the unviability of the union in its current structure, and how increased decentralization is a necessary construct for this union to be viable. And how do we decentralize without, it is easy to decentralize and in the manner in which it pejoratively, it gets called balkanization, right? Like nobody wants violence and strife. But how do you decentralize in an orderly manner such that both parties feel that the reason why this is being done is for greater sort of reflection of the will of the people at the local level of government, right? That is the way forward.